If you've got your Bibles, which hopefully you do, open up to the book of Judges. How long's it been since you've heard that one? Open up to the book of Judges. And we're going to go to Judges chapter 17, just to give you a heads up. Judges chapter 17. That's where we're going to be, 17 and 18 today. All right. So, thanks again for sticking around for Bible class this morning. And I know that we always have several that stay online with us, so we're glad you're here as well. I'll tell you, today has already been a long day for me. It's been a very good day, but a long day. I got the message last Sunday, actually, from one of my friends in England, and he goes, "Hey, with all of our lockdown stuff that we're still under, we've been able to bring in speakers from wherever we want. You want to preach for us this Sunday?" And I was like, "Yeah, absolutely. That'd be great. I'd love to, see old friends and all that sort of thing." And he goes, "Now, the only thing is you've got to be here at 6 a.m. your time in order to preach." I was like, "That's fine. I'm up anyway." Turns out I needed to be up at 5 a.m. because their daylight savings is different than ours. So 5 a.m. this morning, I got to preach in Morley, England via Zoom. It was great. It was a lot of fun. But the best thing about it is while I was preparing for that sermon, I was also asked if I could fill in for class. And I was like, "That's awesome. I'm already working on something." But me being me, I can't just do the same thing twice. So I'll tell you, I was preaching on the priesthood and about how the priests had been established and kind of their role that they had played and how Jesus fulfills his role as a priest. And so I kind of carried them all the way through the Old Testament and into Hebrews and things. It was a lot of fun. But along the way, there was a story about a priest that stuck out to me that I went, "That's worth looking into a little bit more." And it was this story here in Judges chapter 17 and 18. It's a story that we don't talk about very often, especially as kids. If you go to Judges, you're going to talk about like Deborah and Barak, and you're going to talk about Samson, and you're going to talk about all these like mighty things that happened. You're not going to read about Micah and the Leviite. It's not as catchy of a thing to talk about with kids. But as I read this passage, I found there's a lot of modern things that we still do in a little different context, and that we can learn from, grow from, and hopefully become better in our worship of God by studying passages like this. So it opens with this idea of, what have I left? That's the question that Micah is going to ask a little bit later in chapter 18, but I want to try to help you get there. In order to set you up, I've got a map on, let's go 2 slides ahead here. Here we go. So sometimes we think about the book of Judges and we have to remind ourselves the temple has not been established yet, okay? Joshua has brought them into the promised land. They've divvied up the land in all these ways. And right now, they're in that light blue section. You see this city of Shiloh. That's where the tent of God is located. That's where the tabernacle is. That's where all the people are still supposed to be going to do their worship, okay? They're in the city of Shiloh. Now, this story, chapter 17, starts off and says there was a man in the hill country of Ephraim. That's that blue area where Shiloh is, okay? So we're in the same area as the temple of God, or the tent of God, the tabernacle is. These are the people that have like the least amount of excuses for not being able to make it to the place they're supposed to go worship. And we see that this man lives in the hill country. Depending on what part of the hill country, he's at most 20 miles away, which is a journey nonetheless, but not a major one, okay? And I want to set that up in our minds because we as humans, when we read through things, number one, we may not have that sense of scale in our head, but we also want to start making excuses for people along the way. So here in a little bit, when we read what Micah and his mom and their family do, we might be like, "Oh, well, maybe it was really far, or it was really hard, or all these other things." And I want you to keep in mind this picture. There's Shiloh, and just a little bit to the left, there's a set of hills that run kind of right smack through the middle of Ephraim. And that's that hill country area. And one part or another, we're not told exactly where, that's where our story starts. Okay? So we start off and we need to learn about the first set of characters in this story, and it's Micah and his mother. And there's apparently some issues that are going on here about some money that was stolen. And then because Micah ends up feeling guilty about this money that he's stolen, he finally tells his mom, hey, I took it. And so she says, blessed is the Lord. Blessed be my son by the Lord. He's restored this money to me, there in verse 3. And the mother says, I will dedicate this silver to the Lord from my hand to my son to make. Now here's the problem. She's dedicating something to the Lord, and she is going to make a carved image and a metal image. And in the next verse, she gives 200 pieces of silver to the silversmith, who carves it into an image and a metal image. Now again, before we start making excuses, I'm going to skip ahead to verse 6. In those days there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in his own eyes. That's the whole theme of Judges. They get good, they fall away. They get good again, they fall away, because there's no king in Israel, and everyone does what's right in their own eyes. So for whatever reason, these people that live nearby to the tabernacle of God have the idea that they're going to dedicate something to the Lord, but then do the pagan practice of making a little household idol that they'll put into their own space. They don't even just build these idols. Let's go ahead and read here the rest of what happens in verse 5, going back a verse. The man Micah had a shrine. So now it's not even, they're just kind of having the household idols. They've got a whole space for worship set up in their household. Then he has an ephod made. He has the special priestly clothes made. He has these household gods. And then here's the kicker. He ordains his son, who is to become a priest. Now again, these people lived in the land of Ephraim. These were not the Levites. This was not a Levitical family. They had no business being priests. And yet Micah now sees that he's going to take money that his mom has dedicated to the Lord, and then she decided that dedicating it to the Lord makes idols with it. And then Micah says, hey, I'm going to go 1 step, 2 steps, 3 steps, 4 steps further, and I'm going to make priestly garments. I'm going to set up a space of worship, and I'm going to ordain my own son as a priest. None of this is what's supposed to happen. None of this is what they heard from Moses. None of this is what they heard repeated to Joshua. None of this is what the priests who were in Shiloh would have been telling them to do as proper worship to God. As it says on the screen, they are taking worship into their own hands. And it's just step after step. And that's, like I said, I jumped ahead to verse 6 so that we could not make excuses for them in the beginning. But I want to remind you again, the text makes very clear this was not what was intended. Then what happens next? This would have been bad enough, by the way. This would have been a bad enough story if you just went, man, there's a person less than 20 miles from the house of God that is establishing their own pagan place of worship and setting up their own things. But let's keep reading. Next we find out about the Levite. We don't get his name right off the bat. We get it a little bit later in chapter 18, but we're just told that there's this Levite here in verse 7 of chapter 17. It says that he was a young man of Bethlehem, of Judah, of the family of Judah, who was a Levite, and he sojourned there. And this man departed from the town of Bethlehem in Judah to sojourn, where he could find a place. And as he journeyed, he came to the hill country of Ephraim, to the house of Micah. Now, I set all of that up, and we could dig really into the history of it, which I did, and I loved it. But to quickly tell you the bits and pieces here, the fact that a priest is having to sojourn in the lands was a sign to the readers of the day that he was not being properly cared for the way that he was supposed to be. The whole reason the Levites aren't on a Bible map with like, this is the land of the Levites, is because they were spread out throughout all of the tribes. And the tribes were supposed to care for them. They were supposed to give them parcels of land. They were supposed to give them food. They were supposed to be cared for while they did their priestly duties. That was the Levitical tribe. The fact that you have this young man sojourning in the land shows that there's lesser importance maybe placed on them. Maybe there's a lack of them following through on their duties. Whatever it is, you have this young man who's not able to do his job as a priest, and he's going around just trying to find a way in this world, and he happens to find his way to the house of Micah. And when he gets there, Micah says, "Where do you come from?" Here in verse 9. Micah says, "Where do you come from?" The Levite responds, "I'm a Levite." So he's not hiding who he is. He's proud of the fact. He's wanting to maybe use some of that currency of being a Levite to help him out in this situation. But he says, "I'm a Levite from Bethlehem and I'm sojourning." And Micah says to him, any guesses if you haven't read ahead? "Why don't you stay with me? Why don't you be a priest in my household? Be a father to me. Be a priest for me. I'm going to give you 10 shekels of silver. I'm going to give you food. I'm going to give you clothes. I'm going to give you a place to live. Stick with me." Now again, the Levite was proud enough to proclaim who he was and knew what that meant. And so that should set you up to believe again, he knows better than to fall into this trap, right? He knows where the place of worship actually is. He may have even been on his way there. Going from Bethlehem to Shiloh, this could have been part of the traveling path. But he was also a sojourner who it doesn't seem has been cared for very well. And so he falls into a trap here, and as it says, he's content to take the easier path. He agrees. And then in verse 12, Micah, once again, stepping out of the role he's supposed to play, ordains the Levite, not over the house of the Lord, but over Micah's house and his own place of worship. And then I love verse 13, Micah's comment about all of this. "Now I know that the Lord will prosper me because I have a Levite as a priest." Good gracious, this is a comedy of errors, and like every step possible that he could take away from God, he's taking away from God, and yet at the same time he's going, "Man, I'm doing so good in my worship to God, aren't I?" And again, he's right next door to Shiloh. This makes no sense to anyone who's actually trying to follow the God of Israel. So you have a Levite who should know better. You have people who seem to be worshiping God, and they are just making the absolute worst of things. And so I want to make it clear here, true worship was being ignored, and a false sense of legitimacy was being established, okay? He wasn't just going off and worshiping pagans and saying, "Fine, I give up on God." He's saying, "I'm going to worship God, but I'm going to do it my way, in my time, with my people, and I'm going to try to make it look and sound like I'm worshiping God as much as possible. I'm going to try to get really close to it without doing what's actually supposed to be done." This is the part where you start to go, "Oh, that's what we're driving at." Because how often is that the case for us as well? We know what we're supposed to do. We know what we're supposed to be worshiping, how we're supposed to be worshiping, and yet we want to get as close to it as possible, make it look as close to real worship, but we want to do it a little bit our way. We want to scale it back. We want to change it just a little bit. We want to add or subtract just those little things to make us more comfortable, maybe to lift up our own space, maybe to go the easier path, but it's not actually what's being called for us to do. That's something that's happening in this story. And so it begs us to ask the question in our own life as we're going through these things, are we going to be seeking supporters of our own truth? Or are we going to be seeking out supporters of the truth? As the Levite was traveling, he had this moment where he was going along and he could have seen what was happening in Micah and been like, "No, I'm not going to stay here. I know where the true house of the Lord is. That's where I'm going to go." But he was willing to be sucked into this thing because Micah was on the lookout. He didn't see a Levite as just another traveler. He went, "That's a guy who could lend legitimacy to what I'm doing." And the Levite went, "You know what? that's a guy who's willing to give me my wages. Why don't I stick with him? In today's day and age, this is something we see over and over and over. And I could talk about a million examples of where we've decided that we're going to create our own truth in this life because it's easier, it makes us happier, so we think. And then we start to seek out people to do it with us, okay? We have this moment where we go, man, I read that Old Testament story, be it what we read earlier in David, or we read through the book of Judges, or we read Joshua, or all these things, and we go, God is mean. Man, I don't like that God. So we begin to lessen God and his true state as the guy who has set things in motion and knows what is right and is going to carry them through and has true holiness as his purpose and his desire for us. And we decide we really don't want to deal with all of that truth. That's too hard of a truth. I'm going to decide that God is mean, and I'm just going to decide to focus on this loving God that appears out of nowhere in New Testament. And I'm going to say, that's the God I'm going to follow. And so then we start seeking out other people. And we go, man, don't you just hate that Old Testament God? He's so mean. Is that really the... And they say, oh yeah, I don't like that guy either. And so you start to reshape who God is and what his desires are. And you start to say that all the stuff that he's put in motion, it had nothing to do with holiness and coming close to him and commitment to him. And it's just actions like any other earthly king would have taken. Some kings are good, some kings are bad. And that lessens our view of God. That lessens our view of his word. That lessens our need of commitment to him and full assurance and trust in him. It's just little things along the way. And the more that we seek to pull in other people to that story or seek out other people who have already found that story, the more confident we begin to feel in these false senses of worship. We do the same thing in other ways where maybe we decide that Jesus isn't even nice enough. I don't know if any of you have come across recently, but the idea that Jesus actually was a sinner. Jesus did make bad choices. Didn't you know that? Jesus repented of some of his bad choices. Yeah, y'all are looking at me like, what have you been listening to? Yeah, that's what I think too. What have people been listening to? Because if Jesus was not sinless, that means nothing for his sacrifice to have been made. And yet, because people still want to somewhat follow Jesus, but they're not really ready to commit to a sinless Jesus who calls them to something greater, they want to again lower him so that they can come a little bit closer in their worship in their eyes. We see things like this happen time and time again, even as we begin to elevate ourselves. Maybe the whole point of this whole story is to make myself happy. The whole point of this story of all time is for me to serve myself and do the things that bring me joy and make me feel better about my life. Well, guess what? That's not the point of the story. But we can sure look like we're serving God while we're really serving ourselves. And we can find books and teachers and preachers, people in pulpits who will tell us that same story. And we seek them out time and time again. And the stronger those groups get, the more legitimacy it lends itself, and the more we begin to doubt what actual worship was supposed to look like in the first place. And here's the final thing out of chapter 17. As we finish out chapter 17 and move into chapter 18, we find out that false worship is contagious. Because a lot of times I've talked to people who have had some of these thoughts where they want to change what the Bible says, they want to change who God is, and they go, look, if you want to believe that, that's fine, but I'm going to hold on to this. And it's not hurting anybody. It's just my way of approaching God. But it's never just that person. You're going to talk to somebody else, and it's going to plant a seed in their mind. And they're going to talk to someone else, and it's going to plant a seed in their mind. You may actually share an article or a video, and other people see it. It continues to spread because there's just enough truth in these things sometimes that it makes people doubt, and it pulls people away. It started with Micah and his mom. He shared it with his son. They find a Levite. And what we find out moving forward is it's going to spread to his whole neighborhood. And eventually, it's going to spread to an entire tribe of God's people. These sort of things never stay isolated for long. And that's why we must be aware of what God is actually calling us to, the truth that is in his word, and not the way that we have chosen to interpret those things. So again, I want to draw you back up to the map over here, because in chapter 18, we're introduced to the tribe of Dan. It's right here nearby. It's in the pink, right next to Ephraim. And the cities that it mentions here at the beginning of chapter 18, when it says Zorah and Eshtaol in verse 2, you may not be able to see it, but kind of the center of that purple area, just north, across the border into the pink, that's kind of where they're setting up, okay? So again, not very far from Shiloh, the actual place of worship. At most, maybe 30, 40 miles, most likely closer to 30 miles. A full couple of days' journey, depending on who you got with you. But again, not far away. But from where they started to where they're about to travel, Micah's house is probably about the halfway point for them. So we're introduced to the Danites here in chapter 18. And I love this phrase. This one sent me on a good hour, 2 hours of exploration because this sentence really bothered me. It says in verse 1, "In those days there was no king in Israel." Sounds familiar. "And in those days the tribe of the people of Dan were seeking for themselves an inheritance to dwell in, for until then no inheritance among the tribes of Israel had fallen to them." Wait a second. They've already been assigned lands from Joshua. They've already crossed the river. They've been given the lands from God through Joshua. They know where they're supposed to be. They're living where they're supposed to be. And yet it says they had no land assigned to them. And this is going to kick off all their stuff. Well, guess what? It wasn't that they didn't have land. It was that, remember in Joshua we're told that the people didn't completely expel everyone from the land? That's what's going on here. Remember when we hear about the Philistines and how strong they are and how big they are? They're from this region. So it's not that they don't have land, it's that they don't have the land completely because they haven't expelled people out of it. So what they set off to do is they decide to go to the north to find an easier target to take over for their own land. Okay? That's the setup here. The Danites aren't left out of something. They're just like the Levite, looking for this easier path. Now, I'm going to have to speed things up, otherwise we're not going to get through. So I'm just going to remind you, read through these 2 chapters when you get home and really look at what's going on and what the heart of these people, what their heart is as they're making some of these choices. But here's what happens. They head north to find an easier place for them to settle. They come upon the house of Micah. They find Micah as a hospitable space to stay, so it's these 5 guys that are going to scout out, and they stop there. And they hear, somewhere in the distance, there in the household, they hear the Levite. And we don't know how they recognized his voice, but maybe there was some regional sound, and they went, wait a minute, that's a Levite in there. And so they talk to him a little bit, they see what's going on, they see that there's these household gods and the ephod and all this sort of stuff, and they just kind of store that little bit of information in the back of their head. In fact, while they're talking to the Levite, they say, hey, can you ask if God will bless this thing for us? Again, lest you think I'm reading too much into this, verse 1, in those days there's no king in Israel. In the verses before, they all did what was right in their own eyes. So they ask a Levite who's presiding over idolatrous worship to see if God, the God of Israel, will bless their desire to not take the land that he has given them and go find another land that's easier for them to take. This doesn't sound like a good idea. And the Levite, most of the people who, when they read into the deeper Hebrew of this, they say, this is definitely that sort of, he's hedging his bets sort of statement. There's not the strength of like a prophet speaking something. He says, oh yeah, God's got, absolutely he's going to bless you. So they leave the house, they go far north, and they find this peaceful city of people, unsuspecting, untied to any other strong cities who would protect them, and they go, we got it. This is our place. They go back home. They gather together all the warriors of the tribe of Dan, and they say, let's head off, and we're going to take this city, and that will be our place. That will be where we live. But along the way, they remember in the back of their head, there was that Levite and those things and that stuff, and they say, hey, let's consider what we'll do with this. There in verse 14. Let's consider what we'll do. If they wanted to worship God, what they would have done is passed on by. But instead, they knew all the things they were doing were against God's will, and they must have thought, what's one more thing? So they go and they gather the Levite, the ephod, the household gods, all these different things, and they come to the Levite there and they say, keep quiet. Don't alert your master. Here in verse 19, is it better for you to be a priest of the house of one man, or to be the priest of a tribe and a clan of Israel? Why not? You're already worshiping with one guy. Why not come and be part of our worship with everybody? And the Levite says, sure thing. And so he goes off to the north with the Danites. And he goes there and they establish a place of worship and a place for them to live that was never to be intended for them. And again, remember we talked about how this spreads? This spreads over and over throughout the rest of their history. And again, I'm going to fast forward through some things. But they wipe out the people of Laish. Eventually, when the territories split and you have the northern and southern kingdom, the King Jeroboam decides, hey, we're already doing this whole thing where we're splitting off. I'm going to establish my own worship. And he builds 2 golden calves. Guess where he sends one that becomes the center of idolatrous worship in northern Israel for the rest of that time period? The city of Dan, where the tribe went. So idolatrous worship started small, it goes big, it spreads throughout the entire Israelite community, and it's listed as one of the major reasons why they are then cast out of their land when the time comes for Assyria to conquer them. Again, we think, this all started with one guy, with Micah. But it's now spread to an entire tribe, to an entire people. They've taken this bad idea and they've gotten it worse. And it leaves destruction everywhere it goes. We're about out of time, so I want to make sure and end with this. Once they've taken all of Micah's things, he and the people around him tried to overtake the people of Dan. They tried to stop him. And he says, you have taken my gods and my priest, here in verse 24 of chapter 18. What have I left? Micah had dedicated his entire life from that point forward to this idolatrous worship that he tried to package as best he could to look like the right thing, but it wasn't. And when it was ripped away from him, he looks at him and goes, what have you done to me? What have I left? We don't know what Micah did next. Again, he was just a short way away from Shiloh, just a short way away from the tent of God. Maybe this was his wake-up call. We can't answer what Micah did, but for us today, when we start having a deep examination of the things that we're doing in our personal life, in our family life, even spreading to our community and our churches, what are we doing? And if we're one of those people who is harboring some of these things or trying to shift and break the things that God has called us to, maybe we've settled for that shallow Christianity that we talked about several weeks ago, where we haven't really fully committed to God, we haven't become a new person, we just kind of put on the shirt so that we look like him. If that's where we are and that gets ripped away from us, what will we have left? Where will we turn? And this is where the good thing, and I wish I had a whole other hour to explore this, what we have left is Christ Jesus. Micah still could have turned to God. He could still go to worship him, but we still have Christ Jesus. If all of our false worship, all of our untruths are ripped away from us, he is still there. His truth is still truth. The question is, will we become embittered when those things break and fall away or are taken from us? Or will we turn back to him and dive even deeper into the truth we were trying to ignore for so long? So there's a lot there. These are one of those stories that I love digging into because the Bible is full of deep truth, whether we've explored it recently or not. So I hope that this has been something maybe to make you think, maybe to make you read a little bit more throughout the week. Thanks for being here in Bible class. We'll see you next week.